So, Karen, and then amid all of this, the president is trying to now shift the focus on birthright citizenship. The strategy there seems pretty clear, and again, toward his base and any racist tendencies.
Sure. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are saying, you know, this is just another ploy, this is just another distraction coming from Trump. And I think for a lot of people of color, a lot of people of immigrant backgrounds, this is just yet another, you know, assault on lives and livelihoods, regardless of the fact that constitutionally, process-wise, it is not possible for Trump to end this by executive order. Rhetorically, the damage has been done, and rhetorically, this is just another, you know, as part of the migrant caravans, as part of, you know, the chain migrations. The attempt to change the conversation is an effective way to poison the conversations against people of color, against immigrants. And I think what people need to understand is that the 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship, historically was given to freed slaves back in 1868. So this is not just an immigration issue. This is an attack on our civil rights history, on what makes America America. So I think, you know, for us to really understand how broad this assault is, it's not just immigrants, it's also about America's civil rights history.
You know, Mike Barnicle, another example of my gosh, of Lindsey Graham degrading himself for Donald Trump after the passing of John McCain. Yesterday, Lindsey came out and was like, it's about time on Twitter. He was excited that Donald Trump was going to amend the Constitution with an executive order, which, of course, even Paul Ryan said, you can't do that. Justin Amash, Tea Party hero, said, you can't do that. George Conway, constitutional scholar, Kellyanne Conway, husband, said, you can't do that. Like, what? I just wonder, what does the University of South Carolina School of Law think right now, as Tom Nichols asked yesterday? What do they think that a guy that graduated from their program really thinks that you can tear up the 14th Amendment by signing an executive order? Because I don't think Lindsey thinks that, but it just shows you how shameful he has become in John McCain's passing and how stupid Donald Trump thinks the American people are. Because the most conservatives say you just can't do what Donald Trump's saying. It is a clear call to racists to come out and vote for his candidates.
Well, Joe, that gets to the language of this campaign, the language of the president. As you know, I have just spent 5 days in Los Angeles at an event, the World Series, that became trivial, kind of trivial, on Saturday morning after the events in Pittsburgh, after the murder of Jewish people in Pittsburgh. And as you know, a World Series attracts people from all over the country. And this is anecdotal, but it blends in with what Steve and John have both been saying. You talk to people from all over the country, whether they voted for Donald Trump or not, they realize that this country is a community of people who come from different cultures, different countries. Nowhere else is it as prominent in this nation as it is in the basin, in the Los Angeles basin. And you talk to them today, and they want to lower the Bunsen burner flame that this president has done to the country. They want calmness restored. It's a toxic presidency out in the country when you talk to many, many people. It's dangerous. And in some cases, danger turns to lethalness, and you get what occurred in Pittsburgh. The country is not, I don't think, anecdotally, as divided as we think it is. People want community restored. They want calmness restored. And John Heilman pointed out, this particular president has injected himself into this campaign to the point where he said, I'm on the ballot. This is a vote for me. So we're going to find out a lot about the country, the direction of the country going forward next Tuesday.
No doubt about it. And Heidi, very interesting that Paul Ryan and other Republicans on the Hill, even yesterday, were pushing back on Donald Trump's birthright citizenship. Also pretty interesting, the President of the United States asked Paul Ryan and Mitch McConnell to travel with him to Pittsburgh to go and go to that horrid scene. They refused to go with him. Pat Toomey said he was too busy. to mourn with the people of Pittsburgh next to Donald Trump. Now, of course, he's doing it separately from Donald Trump, but you get the real sense right now that suddenly, over the past 3 or 4 days, this, quote, nationalist president has suddenly become too toxic, even for some people who have been enabling him for 2 years.
You do get that sense, Joe, because the denial of actually all 4 of the congressional leaders was so swift. And then you also had reporting coming out of Pittsburgh, Joe, that said that maybe a lot of those families would have welcomed the president, but maybe at a later point that they were still mourning and that this was not the right time in the process. At the same time, I think the president felt like he was in a bind, that if he didn't go, he would be criticized. But it certainly is notable that he could not enlist a single, even Republican member of his own party to accompany him there, and that he understood. Apparently, the reporting is that he was within earshot of those protesters, and that he understood the situation that he was in right there, you know, amid the sounds of those protesters, that he should not say anything, and he didn't coming out of there. And I think that just kind of speaks to the moment that we're in here, where you're seeing those numbers moving swiftly, that there is a sense that culturally this closing argument on cultural lines alone, you know, it's not on tax cuts, it's all on cultural issues that the president is making, maybe in some sense backfiring, because you have 2 forces here. It is not just the suburban swing voter or suburban, you know, moms, the Panera moms, the moms who live within 20 miles of Whole Foods, who the Cook Political Report briefed us on the other day. It is also on the Democratic side, the kind of anger factor that we were briefed on by Cook Political Report, because if you remember back to 2016, the big problem that Hillary Clinton had was that there was a drop-off in traditional demographic groups like millennials and African Americans, and there is nothing more powerful, they told us, than anger and fear, and that is what is now motivating them.
And Mika, it's not just cultural issues this last week. Let's just be really blunt about it. It's why Republicans are scared of him right now. It's been race. He's been playing the racist card. He said, "I'm a nationalist." David Duke comes out the next day saying, thank you so much for finally admitting that you're a white nationalist." And then you have even some Republican backbenchers that are linking George Soros and these anti-Semitic threads to the caravan. You got Fox News talking about smallpox and leprosy coming up. It is, I'm sorry, I won't say specifically what regime this is out of, but go back and read your history books and look at some of the most abhorrent regimes of the 20th century. Might as well be certain countries talking about gypsies. It lines up historically exactly with what certain countries were talking about when they were talking about gypsies and Jews. And Mika, that doesn't play well in Peoria. That doesn't play well in suburban Virginia. That doesn't even play well in western Iowa. That's why you have Republicans now distancing themselves from Donald Trump, going to Pittsburgh, and the head of the NRCC distancing himself from a Republican who basically is identified with white nationalism in western Iowa, Steve King, now for far too long.
And back to Heidi's point about suburban mothers, all types, all across the country. It's a presidency on every level that you just named, Joe, that lacks empathy. And it doesn't sit well.
It's like Charlottesville every day.
No empathy. Still ahead on Morning Joe. Of all the public figures out there, Robert Mueller is probably not the guy you want to mess with.
I'd stay away from it.
I wouldn't do it.
No,
we'll talk about an alleged scheme to smear the special counsel. Plus, President Trump visits Pittsburgh in the wake of the synagogue shooting, where it leaves that community and the nation at large at a loss. We'll talk about that. You're watching Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.